Good morning. Good morning. I've already made the mistake of looking at the bright lights. And I was really praying. I said, God, please don't let anyone sit over in the corners here. Because I knew that I was going to feel like I was ignoring them. Because I tend to do this. I stay here a lot. So for the people over here and over here, I'm not ignoring you. If I don't look at you, I still love you. I'm not ignoring you. We're going to be in 1 Samuel 17. And while you're getting there, I'm going to tell you why we're going to be in 1 Samuel 17. God has had me camped out in this chapter. It is the very well-known, famous chapter of the battle of David and Goliath. And I have just been camped out here. God brought me here about a month ago to this chapter. And this whole time I've been asking, am I in a battle? Why have you brought me to this chapter, God? And as I read it, as I studied it, I love when God does this. I love when God brings us to a chapter, camps us out, and we just pour over that chapter. I like to read it. I like to study it. I like to listen to other people teach on it. I like to listen to it being read to me, and just pour over God's words. And as I did that, He really started to highlight for me everything before David and Goliath fight. He really started to show me that there's something happening here. There is a pattern that happens. There is people responding to certain events. And I thought it was really cool. I know a lot of times we get into 1 Samuel 17, and what do we focus on? We focus on the battle. We focus on David and Goliath and how awesome and courageous David was to walk out there, and how he only killed him with a stone and in a very awesome, mighty way. But there's something that happens here before that battle. It's a pattern. We have 3 times we see confrontation, challenge, and then a response. And so that's what we're going to focus on today in 1 Samuel 17. We're going to focus on, that happens 3 times before David fights Goliath. So let's pick it up in verses 2 through 4. We're going to see the first confrontation. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in the line of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. So here we have our confrontation. We had the Philistines, we have the army of Israel. They've come out to battle against each other. They're facing off. And it's really cool as we get into the challenge now. We're going to see a few things. We're going to pick it up in verse 4. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose weight was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. And the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had a bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. And his shield bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." Goliath comes out, challenges them. And this was very common apparently back then. This is how armies would battle each other. They wouldn't actually fight each other. They would come out and stand in front of each other, look all angry and mean and cool. And then one person from the army would come out and go, hey, listen, you pick your best guy. I'm going to take him on. And if I beat him, you guys are ours. But if he kills me, we'll be yours. Goliath does this. And then we see the response. In verse 11. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Look at the perspective here for a moment. Verse 2, who comes out against the Philistines? And Saul and the men of Israel. That's very important. Look at the perspective that's happening. Who came out? Saul and the men of Israel. How did Goliath view them? The same way. Are you not the army of Saul? Do you not serve him? They were just men to him. They were just men. That's key as we go through this. Look at their perspective, the response that Saul and the men of Israel had. They were scared. They looked at all Goliath had in all his glory, right? All the armor, all the fancy weapons. And they were afraid. They were dismayed. And if we skip down to verse 16, this is crazy. It says, for 40 days the Philistine came forward and took his stand morning and evening. Can you imagine that? 40 days. Morning and evening, Goliath comes out. They line up, right, to face each other. Goliath comes out, challenges the men of Israel, challenges Saul. Can you see the storyline today in the news, right? Day 4. What's going to happen? What's Saul going to decide, right? Day 36. Today we're going to look at the delicacies of the battle line and what they make every day. What are the soldiers eating, right? By now it's like, who cares? We're not doing anything. Goliath's just coming out. He's talking smack, and that's it. Meanwhile, here comes David. David's coming in. Before our second pattern hits, David is going in between doing stuff for Saul and going back and taking care of his father's sheep. And on one trip back, his father Jesse says, hey, listen, I'm really worried about your 3 older brothers that followed Saul into battle. I want you to take some supplies, some food. I've got a gift for the commander that they're under. Go check on them for me. Right? So let's pick it up in verse 12. Now David was the son of an Ephraite of Bethlehem in Judah, named Jesse, who had 8 sons in the days of Saul. The man was already old and advanced in years. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had followed Saul to the battle. And the names of these 3 sons who went to battle were Eliab, the firstborn, and next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 eldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to his father's sheep in Bethlehem. And then we see in verse 16 again the 40 days. And if we skip ahead to verse 19, now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. And David rose early in the morning and left the sheep with the keeper, and took the provisions and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the encampment as the host was going out to the battle line, shouting the war cry. And Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. So here's David. He comes on the scene, and he sees for the first time the confrontation they've been having for 40 days. Israel, the army of Israel against the Philistines, lining up. And now we see the challenge again. Verse 23. As he talked with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines, and spoke the same words as before. And David heard them. So here we have David. He comes up, he's on the battle line, and he sees Goliath in all his glory, and we get the same response from the Israelites, the same response from Saul, but a different response from David. (24 and 25). We see the response of Saul and the Israelites. All the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid. And the men of Israel said, "Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel." So here we go. Israelites, same response. They're afraid. Saul now, after 40 days, he doesn't want to go fight Goliath. He's ready. He says, listen, I'm going to throw the kitchen sink at my men and hope somebody gets the gall to stand up and do this for a big bounty, right? Listen, I'll give you my daughter in marriage. I'll give you great riches. And by the way, your family doesn't have to pay taxes anymore. And what's their perspective? Still the same. They're still seeing Goliath for who he is. They're still seeing themselves for who they are. Just men. But Goliath, he sees them the same way, right? Who's going to come out after 40 days? Goliath's probably like, listen, what's going to happen here? How many times do I got to come out morning and evening before somebody steps up? But then we see a different response from David. And this is really cool. David responds in verse 26. And David said to the men who stood by him, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" See, David had a different perspective. He had his God glasses on. He was looking at Goliath in a different way. He was looking at his brothers in Israel a different way. They weren't just men. They were the army of the living God. And David's response to Goliath gets a response itself. Let's take a look in verse 28. Now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men. And Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, Why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. Eliab's angry. He said, listen, I've been walking out here every day for 40 days looking at this guy. Listen to him talk to us that way. And you come here all filled up thinking you're big and bad, David? Who are you? And then David responds. I love his response. What have I done now? Was it not but a word? And I think we're not reading too much into this. I think we get a sneak peek into David's relationship with his family, especially this older brother. It doesn't seem like this is the first time. He says, what have I done now? I don't think it's the first time Eliab's come down on David or looked down on David like this. And then David's response to Goliath gets a response from his fellow Israelites, so much that they go tell Saul, hey, Saul, guess what David's saying? And so David summons Saul, and then we see David respond to Saul off of the response he gave to Goliath. And we're in verse 31 now. When the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul and sent for him. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And now we see Saul's response to David. You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth. Who's pumping David up in this? Right? David continues to have his God glasses on. There ain't no one saying, hey, David, you got this. Yeah, God's behind you. Go get him. Nobody. Twice now David's been put down. Twice. And then we see David respond. Verse 34. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he rose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them. For he has defied the armies of the living God. This is key. How do you walk into this situation and keep your God glasses on? Keep that view of, listen, this is who I am, this is who God is, and this is who you are. When everybody around you is looking at you like you're crazy. Like something's wrong with you. They're not cheering him on. And finally now, Saul says, okay, God be with you. Go get him. Right? And of course, Saul's answer now is what? Let me give you my armor. Let me give you my armor. You can't go out there unarmored. I mean, come on. Look at you. And David decides, no, that's not going to work. And now we see the final confrontation, the final challenge, and the final response. In verses 40 and 41, we see the confrontation. Then he took his staff in his hand, this is David, and he chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. And the Philistine moved forward and came near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. So now it's not the army of Israel facing the Philistines. Now it's David versus Goliath. And once again, here's Goliath's final challenge, right? The final time Goliath will step up to the plate. In 42. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, come to me, and then I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. Goliath, his perspective hasn't changed all along. He still sees the Israelites as just men, and now he sees David as just a young boy who is very foolish for stepping up against him. And now we see David's response. Verse 45. Then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. Three times we see this pattern. 3 times we see the same response sometimes, and then we see a very different response. And this is what got me. This is the take home for me. What made David keep his God glasses on? In the midst of all that, you see, it was big enough for David to step out against Goliath and fight him. But what about the fight before the fight? What about the time he had to walk through and stand up for God all by himself? What makes someone do that? Is it an incredible faith? Did he just muster up the faith and the courage, pull himself up by his bootstraps, and say, I'm going to do this for God? Was it just dumb courage? Or was it a humble dependence? That's where God brought me through this chapter. As we look at the take home, I saw David do 2 things. The first thing David did is he based every decision he was going to make. Every view he had was based on who his God was and who God said he was. No matter how bleak it was, no matter how impossible it was, he knew who God was. He knew who that made him. Look at what his first response to the Philistine, Goliath. He says, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? He knew who he was. He purposely tells his brothers from Israel he's an uncircumcised Philistine because he knew the circumcision made a covenant with him and God and his brothers. And that made them different. That made them something else. That meant something. That meant their lives were changed. God was for them, with them. During the summer, I like to sit under the tent when Calvary Kids is doing their thing before service. I like to listen in because I know I need to be reminded sometimes of the simple truths of God that we teach our children. And this summer, they said something about humility to the kids that I thought was so profound. And I think it fits so well with what David's trying to do here. And if I'm saying this wrong, you can yell at me, Phil. They said to the kids, humility is having the right understanding of who God is, of who I am, and who others are. Let me say that again. Humility is having the right understanding of who God is, who I am, and who others are. Man, when I heard that, I wanted to run over, even though I can't sit Indian style, and I wanted to look at Phil and say, Uncle Phil, tell me more. Preach. That is so good. That's exactly what David did here. His view of everything in his life was transformed by his relationship with God. When he looked at himself, he saw himself through the lens of God. When he looked at other people, he saw himself through He saw them through the lens of God and who God made them. That is key. The second thing David did is he saw God differently. 2 times David refers to God as the living God. Not just God, the living God. 2 times. He tells his fellow Israelites this, and in front of Saul, he says, we are the army of the living God. His God walked beside him every moment. He was present. He was there, right there with him. David didn't walk into battle against Goliath alone. It wasn't David's fight. His last words to Goliath were, "For the battle is the Lord's." It's the same God that walked with him as he got older, that when he was in a cave and he saw the man that was trying to murder him, it was that same God that walked with him that gave him the ability to let that man go without taking his life, even though he could have done it in a second. He says to his army at the time, David says, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord. The Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed." He was able to do the thing that Jesus calls us to do. He looked at his enemy and found grace and mercy for him. It's the same God that walked with him when he lost his God glasses and he went up to a rooftop. And he looked over Bathsheba taking a bath, which started a roller coaster of sin. It's the same God that walked him through that. And he was able to stand before the prophet Nathan and hear the words that, "Hey, you've gotten it wrong, David. You've gotten it wrong." And then David to turn and realize, "Oh God, I am sorry." That's the God David walked with. He's the God that David poured his heart out to. He could talk to him about anything. He could talk to his God about sin, about heartache, about his enemies, trials, battles, whatever it was. Look at the Psalms. David just poured his heart out to him. A God that already knew David's heart. Loved him so much he wanted to hear David say the words. That's your God. He wants to hear the same from you. He wants to walk with you in everything. He wants to hear your words, your heartache, your pain, your sin. He already knows where your heart is, but he still wants to hear it. Look at Psalm 139. This is what I'm talking about. This is how David saw his God. "O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my lying down. You are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. You hem me in, behind me, and before, and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high, I cannot attain it. Where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. Does that sound like a God that's somewhere else? Does it sound like a God that's sitting up in heaven yelling pep talks down to us? You got it, Josh. It's okay. No, he's right here. Because David walked his life like this, it transformed him. It transformed him. He was never the same. Throughout his whole life, it continued to transform him. And I leave you with this. This is the same example your Jesus gave to us. This is the same way Jesus walked on this earth. Let's look at John chapter 15. We were here not too long ago. Listen to Jesus give us this example of this relationship that we're talking about today. Because that's what it is. It's a different kind of relationship. I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. And every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. Already you are clean because of the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away like a branch and withers. And the branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you abide in me, and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. By this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples. That's how Jesus lived his life. He put his God glasses on, and everything he did, everything he saw, it was based on that relationship. And when he poured his heart out to God, he poured his heart out to God. That's what this world needs. This world needs brothers and sisters in Christ with that type of relationship. That's the light this world needs. It needs that to heal. It needs that to be free. And it takes and starts with us. It starts in our own hearts, our own lives. That's what this world needs. It doesn't need a vaccine. It doesn't need more shots. It doesn't need more resources, more money. It needs more relationship with Jesus. What glasses do you have on today? How are you talking to your God? Have you shared the deepest parts of your hearts with him? Because that's what he wants. And that's what's going to change this world. When we start walking around every day with that relationship. When everything in our lives are viewed through that lens.